So without further ado, let's move over to Peter Conradi, who is a Program Director on Integrated Reporting from the University of Pretoria. He is a Chartered Accountant by training with a Master's in the field of Responsible Leadership, and he's currently working on his PhD in Assurance of Sustainability Information. This morning, he is going to talk to us about the research that he's undertaken around rational purpose. So welcome, Peter Conradi.
Hi guys, welcome to today's session. Thank you for taking the time. I'm going to be talking to you about the rational purpose. So there's a couple of things I want to cover. I'm going to time myself because otherwise I just go completely crazy with my time. So let's start the clock. So in terms of an introduction, there's been, I don't know, probably in the non-financial world, there's been a lot of talk on this whole idea of what a rational purpose of an assurance engagement should be, and what it is. So, in the simplest terms, the rational purpose requirement says that the assurance provider should not accept an assurance engagement if the information needs of the intended users will not be met. What that means is that currently, a lot of assurance engagements have got a very limited scope, and it might not necessarily meet the needs of the users, and that is the contention is that doesn't represent the public interest. So, why is this the case? I think there's a lot of reasons, and I'll get into some of those today. But I think the most important ones are, firstly, there's no consensus around what the underlying subject matter is. In other words, what is a sustainability report really supposed to be all about? We haven't really nailed that yet. And then consequently, the question is also about the reporting framework that we should use. So most of these engagements use the Global Reporting Initiative, but that is not, there's no consensus around the fact that is actually the best framework to use. And what then happens in this uncertain space is that it allows management bias to take hold. In other words, management produces information that would be to their best interest and to the organization's best interest, and not necessarily in the public interest. So a big part of this movement of towards the rational purpose is to think about what is really going to represent the public interest. And the public interest is around what the intended users want to know. And the question is, who are these intended users? What do they want to know? And what interest, knowledge, and power do they have? So we'll get into that a little bit today. So firstly, let's just go back to the areas that we'll cover. I've introduced this, then we'll talk about international development, a little bit about what's going on in South Africa, some technical aspects of SOBS 1. So that is the South African Assurance Engagement Practice Statement 1. And that is the standard that was developed by the IRBA that will become effective at the end of this year, that all assurance providers that's registered with the IRBA should take notice of. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then hopefully the majority of my talk will be about the research on the rational purpose. So in terms of what's going on internationally, it's been a busy time. As you can see, I think I'm only going to mention the March 2020 publication, the public consultation on proposed guidance on EER. EER is what the IAASB calls extended external reporting. And what that is it's extended external reporting refers to all types of non-financial reporting, as we talked about it in this space, and that is sustainability accounting, integrated reporting, and carbon accounting. All of these fall under the umbrella of extended external reporting. And this proposed non-authoritative guidance is supposed to be guidance for the whole world on how to deal with assurance engagements, and ISA 3000, it's supposed to support ISA 3000. So I would really recommend taking a read, giving this a good read, because it's really interesting reading. We've tried at the IRBA in the development of SOBS 1 to take cognizance of the developments internationally, and we've made sure that our guidance doesn't contradict the international guidance in any way. So once this document has been published the 13th of March, so we are in the process of making sure that this latest document doesn't contradict anything that we talk about. And yeah, so that's where we're at with the international process. I think there's two important things to keep in mind in terms of the difference between the South African guidance and the international guidance. And most importantly, the first thing is our guidance in South Africa is specifically focused on the rational purpose requirements. Theirs is a little bit more broad, and the second thing is their guidance will be non-authoritative, whereas the South African guidance is authoritative. So, you're compelled as an insurance provider registered with the RBA to comply with this guidance. Here and there throughout my presentation, I'll mention one or two things that is relevant in the international guidance, but I'm not going to focus on that too much. Now, as part of this research, we did a bit of a survey, you can say, of the top 40 South African companies and what do they disclose on sustainability reporting and what do they have assure. So, most of them do disclose something about sustainability reporting, but most importantly, do they seek assurance on it? And I think, according to what you will see there, is like 24 people, 24% of the 40 companies actually seek assurance on this information, but 16 do not. So the question is that, does the market punish non-compliance in terms of this? And it appears not. Only 7 out of the companies who actually sought assurance on a reasonable level. Most of this work is being done by registered auditors, and most people use ISA 3000 when they conduct this type of work. So that's basically a bit of just a snapshot of what's going on in South Africa. And I think important to note here is that it is an unregulated space where assurance providers registered with the RBA actually competes with assurance providers not members of the IRBA. So that's and the market doesn't punish any of this type of behaviors really. Okay, so let's move into SOBS 1. So in South Africa, we developed this guidance to support the application of ISA 3000. And what this SOBS 1 guidance essentially does, it's asking the question of what are these explicit fundamental building blocks of an assurance engagement and reporting. So what it says is that when we do financial accounting and assurance, we do not question where it really comes from. It's been in existence for such a long time. We don't question whether the subject matter is fixed and whether there's consensus about the reporting framework and what the subject matter information is supposed to be. These things have been agreed on and there's consensus. So what happens with the rational purpose requirement, it loosens up this debate to ask ourselves the question, what are these explicit fundamental building blocks? So these building blocks are firstly the subject matter. What is this thing all about? What is sustainability reporting trying to tell a story about? That then helps you to figure out what the lens is supposed to be that you interpret the subject matter with. And that is the reporting framework. And then the information that results from applying this lens is the subject matter information. Now, as we know, there's no consensus around the underlying subject matter. Hence, we're not sure what the lens should be, and then we're not sure what the subject matter information is supposed to be. As a little bit of a analogy of what subject matter information is, we can think about medical science. And in medical science, the underlying subject matter is the human body. Then we use all of this knowledge in the medical science to think about areas of the lungs or the feet or the brain is areas that gets disaggregated, that becomes subject matter information. In the context of sustainability reporting, the overall underlying subject matter, we simplified here as saying it's sustainability performance. Now, sustainability performance there's not really consensus about what that is, but that's not the point I'm trying to make here. That is, for the purposes of this argument, the underlying subject matter. Then you can disaggregate that to environmental, social, governance, and economic. And if you take social performance, you can then again disaggregate it to health and safety, human rights, and customer satisfaction. And then you can again disaggregate customer satisfaction to specific measurements and KPIs. Now, in terms of how this is relevant for the rational purpose, is we need to understand what the top underlying subject matter is before we can know whether we are interpreting it correctly and whether we're developing the KPIs that's going to interpret or measure that underlying subject matter effectively. Now, you might think that we're already doing that, but if you think about it a little bit more, we're not really that sure of what it is supposed to be, because some people say the underlying subject matter is value creation. Other people say it is supposed to be risk management of sustainability information, and other people say it's supposed to be sustainable development, and other people say it is supposed to be social environmental justice. Now, each one of these things that I've mentioned now will have radically different subject matter information as a result of interpreting the phenomenon in the way that you interpret it. So I'm hammering on this point because it is crucially important to figure out what this underlying subject matter is when you're thinking in terms of rational purpose. So, how does SOBS 1 work? So, it's got some introductory information, then it talks about the rational purpose, and it talks about the appropriate underlying subject matter and suitable criteria. Now, I'm not going to focus on the underlying appropriate subject matter and suitable criteria too much, because that's not central to this talk. I would suggest that you read that, but I'll say a little bit about something about the rational purpose. So how an assurance provider should go about figuring out whether there is a rational purpose is, firstly, what is the underlying subject matter, and then trying to think about what is the context of this organization in terms of in what sector do they operate, what do they do, where do they have operations, and all of these issues helps you to understand what this underlying subject matter can be. Also, what is the reporting frameworks that they use? Do they have systems and controls in place? And what are their supporting policies and procedures? And these things help you to figure out, have they got these infrastructures in place to produce relevant and complete information that helps you to understand whether a rational purpose could be in place? So that's essentially what the standards is trying to do, is to try and figure out whether this organization have the systems and controls and procedures and frameworks in place to produce relevant and complete information. So that's what you try and do. Now, if I'm going to just scroll through these slides because I don't have time to look at all of these things. If you now come trying to make a conclusion, then you're saying, I think for company X, they should be reporting on 20 KPIs. That'll meet the information needs of the intended users. If they do give you that scope to assure, then you're coming to the conclusion the rational purpose is present and you can accept the engagement. If it is not present, if you are saying that we think they should be assuring 20 KPIs, but they're only asking in the scope for 3, then obviously you're going to come to the conclusion that the rational purpose is not present. Then you discuss it with management. If they don't want to change the scope, you cannot accept the engagement. So what do you do then? And this is really important. You can assess a new assurance scope, but that can't be an ISA 3000 engagement anymore. Then it'll have to be some other form of engagement, like agreed upon procedures. And a lot of these international guidance are saying that maybe you should do an assurance readiness exercise as a separate engagement, maybe even before you accept the real engagement, you do a separate engagement to figure out, because you're going to have to take a look at some of this information, especially if it's a new client. You're going to have to look at a little bit at their systems to figure out whether a rational purpose is present. So then these alternative forms of engagement becomes an option. Okay, so there's a lot of meat on how this new practice will play out, and you know, if I had more time, I could talk about this for days and days. Now, if we're talking about the rational purpose of research that we did, the main purpose or objective of this research was to figure out what is the information needs of the intended users, and we also tried to figure out how this new SOBS 1 rational purpose requirement will affect practice in South Africa. So the first thing we tried to do is to speak to the most important users or stakeholder groups, and that is report preparers, assurance providers, users that are investors, and users from social and environmental persuasion. And that means that we looked at these 3 main areas, and what is the underlying subject matter? What do these 4 groups think the underlying subject matter is or supposed to be? What do they think the purpose of reporting is supposed to be? And what do they think the purpose of assurance is supposed to be? And the contention for looking at it in this way is that if we understand their views about the purpose and the underlying subject matter, it will be much easier for us to figure out what are the intended users' needs really are, as opposed to trying to make a long list of what all the information needs are supposed to be. Okay. And then obviously, how does this affect the implementation of the rational purpose requirements? So what we did a couple of things. Let me just take a sip of water. We did a couple of interventions. First, we did a Q methodology survey. What that tries to do is it tries to make explicit people's implicit understanding about a specific phenomenon. That's all I'm going to say about that. Then we had focus groups, interviews, and more focus groups. And from this process, we gathered lots of information that I'll try and summarize in a quick and easy way for you now. First, most important finding, and this comes from the academic literature, there's basically 3 ways that people think about the subject matter of sustainability. The first one is the business case orientation. So if you're in that orientation, it means that you'll only do sustainability reporting if it in some ways drives efficiency, growth, and profit. Second thing the second way you can look at it is from a stakeholder accountability point of view. And that is meaning that you think about stakeholders from their implicit value point of view as opposed to just how they can affect your bottom line. And then the third orientation is the critical view. And that is where you actually think about social environmental accounting. You have to point out the contradictions in capitalism. It's going to be a forceful change for sustainable development. So it really is a transformational type of way to think about it. So these 3 orientations are broadly the spectrum in which most people fall when it comes to thinking about sustainability accounting and sustainability reporting. So this is the results that we got from the Q methodology. So there's a lot of information in this slide, and I don't want you to get confused with it too much. I'm just going to focus on 1 or 2 things in this slide, and I'll talk you through it. So when people complete the Q methodology survey, you group them into factors, or it's actually groups of people that completed the survey in a similar way. So we've got 5 groups of people, and we're essentially focusing for this conversation on factor 2 and factor 5. So factor 2 is a group of people that's predominantly made up of investors and social and environmental groups, and they very much, I can't now give my pointer, but they're very much focusing on the business against the business case. They think that social environmental accounting shouldn't be done for business case reasons. They think it should be done from a critical or stakeholder accountability point of view. So these, the investors and the social environmental users sits on the left of the continuum of the distribution. They think it should drive change. Then you get the opposite side of the continuum, and they are report preparers and assurance providers, and they believe that this type of work should be done from a business case perspective, and they are against the critical view. So evidently, you've got these 2 groups. You've got the preparers and the assurance providers on the one end of the continuum, and users of the investors and the social and environmental groups at the other end of the continuum. And these guys represent these 2 polar opposites. And the irony is, the users or the people who use information needs you have to meet have got a diametrically opposed view of what this practice is supposed to be all about, vis-a-vis the people who are actually preparing this information. So there you've got a bit of a dichotomy. And in academia, we like dichotomies. So I'm going to try and to emphasize this dichotomy a little bit. So I'm going to jump through all of these. I'm going to summarize the findings on 3 levels: a systemic level, ideological level, and the technical and the practical level. So what this all comes down to, on the systemic level, what the problem is that this is voluntary practice. So, and the reason why it's voluntary is because initially we wanted people to adopt practice, and we wanted to encourage adoption by making it voluntary. And that was a great idea at the time. What's happened is report preparers are completely controlling this whole practice. They're the ones who are deciding what they want to report. They're the ones who are deciding what they want to get assured. And assurance providers have got no power because it's voluntary, it's not mandated, and they are competing against other assurance providers in this space, and the market doesn't punish this behavior. So this creates a space where reporters are in this powerful position where they control everything that's going on, and the assurance providers are in a completely disenfranchised position. And in a voluntary environment, it's difficult to see how this power will shift from report preparers to users and assurance providers. Now, we put this to everybody in the study and asked them, what should we do about it? And obviously, the simple answer is we should simply regulate this practice. But that's not that simple. Who's gonna take ownership of this regulation? And the suggestion is it should either be government or the JSE. And how that's going to happen is a challenge, but we're trying to push that agenda in some way. So that's a systemic level. On the ideological level, I've already mentioned this, and that's the business case, stakeholder accountability, and then you've got the critical view. Now, as we've already sort of agreed on, is that we know that the report preparers is pushing this business case idea. So ideologically, this business case ideology is dominating this practice, and the people who wants this information is from a different ideological perspective. So how do you shift the power from this business case view to this more critical view, or the stakeholder accountability view? And we don't really know how to shift that power, because in this current system that we're functioning in, to see how this power will be shifted is really challenging. And what that comes down to is the report preparers are delivering or preparing these reports mostly to think about how it will affect value creation and drive reputation and risk. So we've seen that because of this ideological perspective, it is not sustainable development. These reports are not about sustainable development or social and environmental justice. It's not about that. And you can argue whether it should be or not, but that's sort of what the research says. That's where the phenomenon is sitting. And that then speaks to the technical and the practical level. And what that means is that at the moment, and I've already mentioned this, we don't have consensus about the underlying subject matter, what this report really should be all about. And that then taps into the fact that we don't know what the relevant reporting framework should be and how to apply professional judgment in this context, because we don't have consensus around these issues. What also becomes really important on a technical level, that's a really important challenge, is because it's a pre-engagement activity, the rational purpose is a pre-engagement activity, there's a lot of work that needs to go into it, but it's not part of the engagement. So the assurance provider is basically doing this work for free. And then when you're not an assurance provider, not registered with the IRBA, you don't have to do that level of rigor, and that creates a competitive disadvantage for assurance providers registered with the IRBA versus those not registered. And another important issue is this whole idea when you're in the request for proposal phase, how do you get information to satisfy the rational purpose requirement? Because you're essentially being told, this is the 4 KPIs, put a proposal in for that. If you don't like it, you don't have to put a proposal in, but how do I get enough information to know that that'll meet the rational purpose requirement? As an assurance provider, it's really, really hard in this request for proposal. So the international guidance suggests 1 or 2 ways to get beyond that, but it's a lot of challenges that we don't really have to have answers for at this stage. So to conclude, I'm on almost 22 minutes. I've given you a broad, quick view of what this is all about. Now, we know that when there's a lack of regulation in this voluntary environment, it's going to be really hard for this practice to really become effective. So essentially what we're saying, there's an ecosystem, a systemic, ideological and technical practical ecosystem wherein the SOBS 1 standard is supposed to now become effective, but this ecosystem is not going to support the standard. So how do you create an ecosystem that will support the standard? And that's quite a challenge, because a lot of these things is not driven from a central point of view. We don't necessarily have answers to all of these things at this point in time, but along with SAICA and the RBA, we are monitoring the way that people are implementing the rational purpose requirement, and hopefully we will come up with more answers as we go along. So that's essentially my story. We will send the research to everybody who's registered on this webinar, so you can have access to that, and I'll be happy to answer questions now if there is any questions.